Aua wairea te one tapu, ka hura tangata auta te tūraki atu ki tangata tai. Ka hura tangata tai te tūraki atu ki tangata auta. Pērā hoki rā te kōrepe nui, te kōrepe roa, te wā hiawa te toi toi awa, whakamau tama ki te ara, whakamoe tama ki te ara, no tū norongo whano haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Nau mai e te iwi ki tēnei tō tātou whare kōrero, mihi ana ki te wā hingaro te tīmatanga me te whakautinga o ngā mea katoa. Koutou te hunga wairua e takoto tiraha maina ki ngā marae huhua, haere o tiatu, hoki mai ono rā ngā rārangi kōrero kia tātou te kanuhi ora, nau mai, tau mai, kuhu mai ki tēnei whare kōrero a tātou, kei te mihi. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Watch Me Grow. My name is Kawiti Waitford, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the team. Today's webinar is hosted by A Better Start National Science Challenge and the Whānau Āwhina Plunket. A Better Start National Science Challenge is a collaborative research program working to help children, teenagers and their whānau achieve the best possible start in life. Its mission is to find practical, evidence-based solutions that make a measurable difference for tamariki, improving the potential for all young New Zealanders to have a healthy weight, good literacy skills and sound mental health. Whānau Āwhina Plunket is a charity and Aotearoa's largest support service for the health and well-being of tamariki under 5 and their whānau. It offers free Plunket nurse visits, a free 24-hour Plunket line, along with parent groups, education courses, play groups, and more. Today you'll hear from these 3 guest speakers, Dr. Lisa Daniels, Dr. Denise Guy, and Whaia Waikura Kamo about the latest research and developments in infant growth, including using BMI as a measure for nutrition in infants, how to interpret it and what it predicts for the future, and how to approach the conversation with parents whose child is gaining weight too rapidly, and how to separate a demand for food versus a demand for attention. Now, before we start our webinar, a little housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including Q&A. All audience members will be automatically muted throughout the session, and a recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. Please submit questions using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Use the chat for chat, and please submit all questions you might have to that Q&A function. Sometimes you get a bit anyway. E te whānau, our chairs for today are Professor Barry Taylor, the Deputy Director of A Better Start National Science Challenge, and Whānau Āwhina Plunket's Chief Nurse, Dr. Jane O'Malley. Welcome again to you both. And again, Whānau, questions in the Q&A function, please. Over to you.
Okay, kia ora, everybody. It's good to see a lot of people joining the webinar. I think we're up to 140 or more. And my initial introduction, before I introduce the speakers, is measurement of growth is a key factor in assessing whether a child is healthy or not. We've spent the last 50 years, becoming really comfortable with babies who don't grow very well, failure to thrive, and we've got really good systems of identifying it and then doing something about it. That is now done well right across many countries, including New Zealand. What is relatively new and why we're doing this as a National Science Challenge sort of project is that children, up to a third of the children have now got an unhealthy weight, and how they get there is really important. And what we do in looking after our younger children, especially under 2 or 3 years of age, what we do there is important in actually leading to a healthy growth, not just in weight, but in body fat in the body. And our first speaker is done a lot of work in the area of how we should monitor the growth in terms of either becoming in terms of nutrition. And so there's going to be a focus on BMI as a measurement of nutrition. And to introduce Lisa, she's a research fellow in the Better Start Big Data team. She spends a lot of her time working on the Plunket data that is collected electronically and is expert at that big data analysis. But she comes from a dietary background. She has a postdoctoral fellowship in conducting research on breast milk. and also did her doctoral studies looking at infant feeding in particular. So she was involved in the contract that the National Science Challenge held with the Ministry of Health to review some of the key things related to well childcare, and in particular the aspects of growth. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa and ask her to tell us a bit more about BMI in under 2-year-olds in particular.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Barry, for the introduction. So the information I'm going to be presenting today is a brief summary around growth screening, and particularly, as mentioned, the use of BMI in the well child setting. So there's more detail on this topic in this rapid review report, which I was involved with. So the Ministry of Health contracted the National Science Challenge to review 11 areas of the Well Child program, and the full report's available on the Ministry of Health website if you're interested in reading this in a bit more detail. So the approach to assessing growth in childhood should be using measurements for which growth charts are also available. So for weight, length or height, head circumference and BMI. And growth charts allow for the tracking of child's growth over time, rather than just at one time point. And they are relevant to the child's age and sex. So this means that any changes in growth can be identified, and ideally early intervention can be put in place if necessary. So as Barry mentioned, I'm going to focus a bit more on the excessive growth in this brief talk today, just because of the general need for recognising excess weight gain, whereas as Barry mentioned, that poor growth and failure to thrive, as an example, is generally better at being identified and managed. And currently there is little evidence and guidance for healthcare professionals in identifying children at risk of excessive weight gain. So the use of BMI is currently recommended by the World Health Organization for children over 2 years of age. However, there's growing evidence around its effectiveness in identifying overweight and obesity in children under 2 years of age, and particularly around predicting later obesity. And I'm going to show you some of this evidence shortly. So it's important to note that assessing BMI in the well child setting would not be for diagnosing a child as obese, but to screen for potential weight and health-related problems. So for example, a child might have a high BMI for their age and sex, but to determine if excess body fat is a problem, we would need more information to make an appropriate assessment. So for example, we'd need more information on their diet, physical activity, family history, and any other appropriate health screenings. So the consequences of excess weight in childhood include an increased risk of poor cardiovascular health, for example, diabetes, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, also a range of cancers and even early death. And alarmingly, the effects begin to affect children as young as 5 years of age, with some evidence of insulin resistance occurring in obese 5-year-olds. So often BMI is converted to a Z-score, either in the clinical setting or in published research. You may have heard of BMI Z-score and wondered what it is, or you may already be familiar with it, but just briefly, a Z-score can also be referred to as a standard deviation score, or abbreviated to SDS, if you've heard of these. The calculation of the Z-score standardizes the BMI value to allow you to compare a child's BMI to a reference population of the same sex and age. And the Z-score specifically shows you the distance and the direction a child's BMI value is away from that reference average. So a positive Z-score lies above average and a negative Z-score lies below average. And most children will fall somewhere between -1 standard deviation and +1 standard deviation, which is approximately equivalent to the 15th and 85th percentiles, if that's what you're more familiar with. So I'm going to describe some of the key recent findings suggesting that BMI is a good tool to use even in early infancy for predicting later obesity. Oh, sorry, gone too far. So one of these studies was a Swedish longitudinal study by Lindum and colleagues, and they reported that girls and boys who are overweight or obese at age 5, as represented by the blue line, had higher BMI Z-scores at all previous measurements before 5 when they were compared with normal or underweight children. So that's represented by the children in green. For reference, in this age group, a crossing of above +1 standard deviation is considered at risk of overweight. So you can see for the group that were overweight or obese, so that blue line again, that the crossing of 1 standard deviation occurred at around 36 months of age for the girls and around 30 months of age for the boys. So from this study, the authors concluded that early BMI measurements in clinical practice is useful for the early identification of children at risk of overweight or obesity. And just a reminder here that the study is reporting group averages, and this data doesn't show individual growth patterns, and there will be large inter-individual variation in growth. Some of the children who are represented in blue will have come down to the green line, and some of the children in green will have climbed up, but it's this continuous rise in growth that is a worry and warrants further investigation. So there are a couple of other studies from the United States that have also reported similar findings to the previous study I just showed. Both of these studies concluding that high BMI in early infancy was predictive of obesity at age 2. This first study also reports that almost 50% of children in the highest BMI category at 2 months of age were considered obese at 2 years of age. And the second study also concluded that infants with a high BMI had a higher fat mass even from as young as 1 month of age. So these studies do show support for the use of BMI in assessing growth in early infancy, with a clear association between BMI and obesity in early childhood. And since the Well Child Review has been published, there have been more publications showing similar findings, such as the study by Rossman and colleagues. And what these results show are that children who were categorized as obese at 13 years had BMI Z-scores which continued to increase throughout infancy and childhood. And that's represented in figure A by the red line. Whereas children who are not categorized as obese at 13 years of age, the average BMI Z-score remained close to 0. So that's those children tracking along in the blue line. So in the second figure B, they also reported that the largest annual increases in BMI Z-score were shown to be at around 2 to 4 years of age. And again, just keeping in mind that these are population averages, so we will see individual variation. So the study that I've just shown you before by Rossman and colleagues, they also did show you a little bit of tracking on a more of an individual level. So not exactly individual, but it does show you how individuals do have different growth trajectories and can transition between categories over time. So some children who may be considered overweight or obese before 2 years of age on the left-hand side will move into, for example, normal or underweight categories by 5 or 6 years of age. And some of those who were underweight in the under 2 years of age will move into becoming normal or overweight or obese once they hit 5 or 6 years of age. So it's really helps to demonstrate how important it is to look at a child's growth over time and not just at one time point. So we've seen that there's supporting evidence for the use of BMI in infancy, and that higher BMI, even in early infancy, is predictive of obesity in later childhood. But we're also interested in whether there are specific growth trajectories that lead to excess weight, which might be associated with later obesity. So a little bit more research is needed to fully understand the exact trajectories, and particularly for those under 2 that may lead to later health problems. But what we do know from some of the evidence is that those children that are rapidly increasing in their growth trajectory and those with a stable high BMI trajectory are at risk of long-term health problems, and particularly those trajectories of children which lead to a higher BMI at 10 years of age appear to be more likely to have higher BMI in adulthood. And just to sort of summarize that all, there is a systematic review on the literature of BMI trajectories in childhood. And the conclusion of this systematic review is the same as that of the previous study that I just reported, that the long-term outcomes don't tend to differ too much between children with consistently high BMI and those with rapidly increasing BMI. So there's concerns for those both those groups of children. So that really was a brief summary showing some of the evidence on how BMI in early childhood is useful in predicting later obesity. And as I mentioned, a lot has since come out from the rapid review report, but there is more in detail in there if you're interested. But sort of the next decision would be around what particular growth charts and cutoffs would be appropriate for use in the well child setting. So these are World Health Organization BMI for age charts, and they can be expressed as a percentile cutoff as shown on the left-hand graph, or as a Z-score cutoff as shown on the right-hand graph. And I've just chosen the girls' ones here, but both are widely used formats for displaying and interpreting growth in children. There's likely perhaps more familiarity with the percentile lines, so the left-hand side graph, as that's what's currently used for weight and length and height and head circumference in EPHR, so within Plunket, and also within the well child books. So perhaps the interpretation of the percentiles might be easier, given this is how results around growth are currently discussed with Whānau, and perhaps may keep the message more consistent. However, further discussions would be necessary regarding the most appropriate approach for future use. And just an example here, I plotted my daughter's measurements for her up to 3 years of age, and you can see that she's tracking along that 15th percentile. So what we can see from this is that by implementing the growth charts early on, we can track that children's growth over time and get a better idea of how children are growing over time rather than just at one time point. So currently BMI is only looked at specifically as a one-off time point in the before school check. Some well child nurses might be calculating BMI once the child is over 2, but because perhaps there's no BMI charts on EPHR, from what I've learned, is that maybe that might not be being discussed with the family. So if we're introducing these charts from an early age, conversations around BMI may become easier at the before school check because the parents will have already been exposed to this from a younger age. So it would be great also if there was some sort of flagging system to make it even easier for well child nurses to detect any potential concerns that may require discussion. So for example, those young children whose BMI are rapidly increasing, which may predict later obesity, they could be given a preemptive discussion about their growth, a little bit of understanding on what the interpretation of BMI is and the health consequences of their growth, and be offered brief food, activity, and sleep advice if it was deemed necessary. So just to summarize some of the key messages from what I've talked about is that I've shown you some of the growing evidence in support of using BMI in early infancy, and that those with a high BMI in early infancy indicates a risk of overweight and obesity in later childhood. That BMI would be used to help identify children growing excessively and not as a diagnostic tool. It's important to be looking at the trends of growth over time rather than individual time points. Further consultation would be necessary around which growth charts to implement and how to flag children at risk. And ultimately, the early identification of these children who are growing rapidly is important for the preventative discussions about unhealthy weight trajectories. And hopefully this leads in semi-nicely into Denise and Waikare's talk on how to have these conversations with Whānau. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We won't take questions of this because we'll take time at the end for a panel discussion. And I think this is a really nice transition to now talk about, well, look, Lisa mentioned that at the moment in our current system, you don't really get a BMI calculated until you hit the before school check. We know from some research that we've done here in Otago and across the South Island that when parents are told that they're at the 4-year-old check that their child is overweight, 70% of them find it hard to believe. And a significant number of them actually get quite angry. And when we asked the parents how they felt about this, we got some really angry letters back about how this information is transmitted and how that they really avoid the health system almost as a result of being told this particular result, which was really a big worry to me. So for this webinar, we asked probably the key experts in how to have this conversation. So Denise Guy is a child psychiatrist and probably led the field in infant mental health in New Zealand and been a really strong advocate for us to think a lot more about infant health in New Zealand. She's worked in this area for more than 35 years. She supervises practitioners working with families and young children in this area. And she is the founding trustee of Incredible Families and coordinates training in the Watch, Wait and Wonder intervention, which addresses problematic infant-parent relationships. She's the past president of the Infant Mental Health Association of New Zealand and was recently made an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to infant mental health. So she's going to start off very shortly talking about how we have this conversation, and we'll bring in Waikura Kamo, who is the National Nurse Educator Maori for Whānau Āwhina Plunket. She's had more than 10 years experience as a senior well-child tamariki or a specialty nurse, developed the Plunket Line Maori service for those who wish to speak to a Maori nurse or in te reo, and her mahi is about promoting whānau health in her community and throughout Aotearoa. She's a representative on the National Board of the New Zealand College of Midwives, New Zealand Breastfeeding Alliance, and the Infant Mental Health Association of New Zealand. So these two speakers are going to do a joint presentation, and I'm happy to hand over to Denise and Waikura. You're muted, Denise.
Right.
Oh, there you are. Good.
Thank you, Barry. Tēnā koutou katoa to everyone, and Waikura and I are going to introduce you to the FAN today, promoting this as a useful framework. Now, I am waiting for the slide to move. Here we go. So when thinking about this issue of having these conversations with parents, we think this is a framework that has a lot to offer for scaffolding those conversations. It's a conceptual model and a practical tool for building relationships and reflective practice. It was developed in 2005 at the Erickson Institute in Chicago by Professor Linda Gilkison as an approach to working with the parents of fussy babies and predominantly with home visitors. It's what she calls a meta framework. So it's not model specific, it's generalizable to the helping relationship in many settings. And it's used in programs and systems to promote parent engagement and practitioner and parent collaboration. So in New Zealand, the training is delivered by IMHANS to teams across disciplines and services involved with families and young children. So that's included Whānau Āwhina Plunket, early intervention services, early childhood education, a gateway team, home visitors, NICU clinicians, perinatal and infant mental health clinicians, and in a recent training last week to Pacifica working in primary mental health and addiction services. It's been seen as culturally respectful, and IMHANS is alongside developments to sit the FAN within Pacifica and Māori practice. We've trained 141 clinicians or practitioners since we took on this work. And in the last year in the States, they trained over 1,600 professionals working across a similar range of areas. It's a real pleasure to do this with Waikura. Last week was our first training in developing the capacity for us in New Zealand and IMHANS to be able to train other trainers. And Waikura is becoming a facilitator with the FAN, holding two hats as part of being on our IMHANS executive and working with Anne Hodron to be able to hold this within our Āwhina Whānau Āwhina Plunket. I'm just going to hand to Waikura for just a few thoughts about some recent research that she was reading.
O ngā mihi kia koe Denise, kia ora koutou, tātou katoa to everyone out there. So this has been a topic of interest for a while, and there has been a recent research done in Finland in regards to broaching overweight and obesity at maternity and child health clinics. Now, this particular research talked about, well, a little bit of a background was the mother's obesity and excessive weight gain during pregnancy and rapid weight gain in early childhood increased the risk of obesity of a newborn baby, both in childhood and throughout life. So they did a little bit of a research, and the findings that they found were, with the nurses that were interviewed, considered it was their duty to broach the issue, but they felt that they had insufficient courage to actually bring up about overweight. They sometimes found it frustrating to talk about overweight and obesity because some families, whānau, do not commit themselves to making those lifestyle changes. And the changes happen really slowly. But they did find, the nurses found that the lasting relationship with families were really helpful for bringing up these overweight conversations, these really uncomfortable conversations. So in conclusion, in that study, they found that nurses needed to, have the broaching skills, more training, supervising and tools for bringing up overweight and obesity with client families. The continuity of care in primary health care supports the bringing up of overweight. So it's obviously backed up by research on how do we have these conversations with whānau and when should they start. So that's where Denise have, come together in this piece to, give you a little bit of an insight on what that could look like and how we can broach those conversations safely and with kindness. So kia ora, Denise.
Thank you. Thank you, Waikura. Okay, so we're not quite getting moved. Here we go. And as Waikura and I were talking about this, we really, these are ongoing conversations. This is not a one-off, and we can absolutely understand how you might get such a response when you're bringing it up at 4. And they are conversations that really need to begin with antenatally, with what's happening for mums and therefore what's happening for the baby in utero. So here's the FAN. This is what it looks like. And as we said, it stands for Facilitating Attuned Interactions. It also looks like a fan, and it can help you cool down when needed. So thinking about this value that's put on the relationship that you have with families, this is a practical tool for building those relationships, for getting engagement, and then for reflective practice. It's based on the concept of attunement. So feeling connected and understood. Attuned to creates a space to learn and to try new ways of relating. So it addresses parents' concerns by matching the practitioner's communication to the cues a parent is showing in the moment, and allows us to move flexibly during the contact with a parent based on the parent's responses. So you can see sitting over the top of this fan and its wedges are 5 areas for communication: calming, feeling, thinking, doing, and reflecting. A unique part of the fan is the first process, calming or mindful self-regulation, which is our wedge. It focuses on practitioners It supports us to develop the ability to track, to regulate ourselves, to understand our own reactions during a contact so that we can stay calm, because we need to be calm so that we're properly present and so we can actually think in this time we have with the family. And what we know is that practitioners can learn to do this relatively quickly. The 4 remaining areas require reading the parent's cues, just as we might be wanting a parent to read their baby's cues, and to move flexibly on the fan as needed. Feeling, or empathic inquiry, is providing emotional support when parents are expressing feelings. Thinking, or collaborative exploration, is used when feelings are contained and parents want to think together to understand a concern or to make a plan. Doing, or capacity building, is used when parents are able to focus and are ready to take on new information or to build skills. And reflecting or integration highlights a parent's insights about their child, about their parents, parenting, or about the concerns that they want addressed. It's really important, just reiterating, that these 4 wedges are where a parent is, and that our job is to attune to the parent, not the other way around. So fan training prepares practitioners to identify what we call matches or mismatches, and to make repairs for the interaction when there are mismatches. So a match is when the parent and practitioner are in the same place on the fan. The parent might be expressing feelings and the provider offers emotional support. A mismatch is when a parent and provider are on a different place on the fan. And the most common is the parents and feelings, as in, I'm thinking, Barry, about getting the information at the before school checks and they are angry. And the mismatch is that we commonly get is that practitioners have moved to doing, to giving information, to providing an advice, and parents can't take that in given their emotional state. So when misattunement happens, we need to be able to recognize that, and we need to be able to make a repair so that we can work with this parent and maintain a good relationship and a kind relationship. We're not talking too much. You can see the center of the fan sits with the parent's concerns, and then underneath that are the things that may be very important in terms of what a program or a service is wanting. So they may be our concerns and responsibilities, and we think about how that gets woven into the work that we do with the parent. This is the second major piece that sits within this model called the arc of engagement. You can see it sits over the top of the fan. It provides structure for the time that we have with a parent. And the fan is the guide. It's our map through the interactions that are going on during time with a parent. So we're not going to spend quite so much time on the arc today, but you can see that some of these questions around the outside will align with the fan. So for example, pre-contact is actually about us. It's about making sure that before we begin a session or a visit or a phone call, we are calm, we are able to be present. Our opening questions are often around aligning with feelings, so inviting a parent to share about parenting. And our middle arc question, which is a check on how the visit's going, is there anything that a parent wants to bring up and they haven't, will align with thinking. And then we'll finish with something that is more of a reflection around the opportunity for a parent to think about their child or the session. So we're going to move back to looking at this arc, And I'm going to hand over to Waikura as we walk you through a scenario. Oh, you need to unmute.
Aroha mai, I had to be that person. Ngā mihi Denise, I think the really important thing here is the earlier we can have conversations about nutrition, the better. So when Denise talked about antenatally, so anyone that's working with mums, whānau antenatally, that's when we start talking about conversation about nutrition. You know, healthy nutrition for mum, for baby, and what are their goals in terms of nutrition, and what do they know about nutrition? And so we're having that same narrative conversation right through till baby is born. And then when we're engaging with whānau, again, it's getting them involved in the conversation. When you are plotting on the graph, showing them the graph and getting to obtain the understanding on why you are plotting on the graph and what you would do if you find that baby is going above the average or below. What does the average mean? So it's having those ongoing conversations and building, and the thing that helps with that is it strengthens the relationship, where you can end up having these really good, honest conversations with them. So that's something I really want to, you know, alliterate a bit more about, but also just on the fan, with the boxes down below, talking about building parenting confidence and capability. It is about, you know, trying to support them through parenting, with sleep, with eating, with everything that has an impact with everyone's health and well-being. So Denise and I will demonstrate a very brief scenario on what it could look like and what it could sound like when you do have these conversations with whānau. So just to get us started, I'll just set the scene. So I will be the helper, the practitioner, Denise's mum with her baby. So I'm seeing Denise with her baby, and remember that at the last visit that I saw Denise and baby, I had started to have some concerns that baby was growing too fast. As she comes into the room, the baby appears to have grown quite a bit more. So we'll begin our scenario now. Oh, you're a big boy.
What do you mean? We think he's fine.
Here I recognise the rupture and the need to settle myself. I haven't managed the beginning of the visit in a very attuned way, so I need to take a breath and begin again. You know, I'm sorry, I think I've got us off on the wrong foot. Can we start again? And I breathe, probably 2, 3 breaths, and this is my way of repairing. A little later in the visit, I weigh the baby, and Denise sees the graphic.
That can't be right. Are you sure you're plotting it right? How could he put on so much weight since last time?
No, at this stage, potentially, I could go a different pathway in a different direction. I could go with this and react and say, I don't think there is anything wrong with the scales, Denise, setting off a new rupture. Or I could pause and recognise that I think Denise is sitting in feelings. I need to get myself calm and match this mum if I want to have a productive conversation. Then I could say, it looks like the graph has surprised you a little.
I'm a bit upset. I don't understand what's happened. I'm feeding him. He's a hungry baby. He cries and he cries, so it's hard. Feeding him is the only thing that keeps him quiet for a bit.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really hard.
It is.
Sounds like you're trying to do your best that you can as well. So this is at the point where I might want to talk about the feeding cues or what the baby is being fed. But there is no point in me moving on the fan to what we would call the doing if Denise is still sitting in feelings. Because of her thinking brain is not there yet, it's not engaged. So I'll stay with the validating her feelings and wait until I hear something that indicates that Denise is ready to move on.
He's my first baby, and it's not that easy, I'm finding, to suss him out.
Not easy. Has there been a time recently when he's not wanted so much to feed and feed?
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm just thinking. So a couple of days ago, I'd fed him, and then I had an unexpected visitor, and so I ended up carrying him around quite a bit. And he didn't want any, he didn't want any more food after the visitor left, and he was kind of settled. He wasn't so fussy.
So what you'll note now is that Denise and I are now working in the wedge of thinking together, collaborative exploration. And this is a really good space to take time and respect the parent's thinking about their baby. I can also use this observation of Denise's to say, babies cry for different reasons. This is what we call a drop. In this model, we give information in very small amounts. So we're talking about one drop that you can say in one breath.
Like what?
Like what? What might your baby cry? Why might your baby cry? And after the drop of information, you look to explore with the parent. Out of that, we might say, so maybe sometimes more food is not what your baby wants. And the key thing this opens up is the space to move back into exploring on the fan the cues Denise's baby may give her, or to give a bit more information or resources around cues. So what would you like to try differently between now and when I see you next time?
Well, you know what? I think I'm going to try and leave him just a bit longer between the first, have the first feed and just wait a bit then. See how that goes. Can I call you and let you know how it's going?
That will be brilliant. Ngā mihi, Denise. And I think that's the power of that was Denise was able to reflect on and come up with her own solutions. She ended up having the capacity and the bandwidth to think what practical solutions that she could work with. So kia ora koutou.
So we're just leaving you with where you can go to for IMHANS and where you can go to on the Ericsson to find out a little bit more about the fan. And that's where we will finish our presentation and then be open for questions.
Kia ora. Kia ora to all of our speakers. Maybe if we could stop sharing the screen now so I can see a few more people. I know that there's 173 of you out there, And so just first want to acknowledge the three speakers. Lisa, you've sort of opened us up with the challenge around how insights is great, early intervention and the trajectory and the implications right throughout life, things that challenge us. And then Waikura and Denise bringing us to the challenges. So what do we do with that information? How do we do it in such a way that we take parents with us? Barry raised the issue of, 4 years is probably too late to start a conversation, but it's never too late, even if that's the first conversation, to being open to how people are feeling about that. And I could see part of that process that doctors, nurses, midwives, social workers use, we call it the nursing process, but the medical people call it the medical, but but the difference is around self-awareness of the practitioner and the partnership and taking people with them where they go. We could get into a whole lot of conversation about, but I don't have the time to do that. But actually, we all know that if you don't take the time to do it, the time later is a waste. It is harder. It's just harder, isn't it? So one question that Sharon raised has now gone. So I'm not sure, Sharon, I'll just go back to the questions. No, she asked us that she made a comment about our practice in Whānau Āwhina, and it did occur to me that we do need to think about the question Barry raised earlier on about are we stopping seeing babies at 5 months? We're not. And it's obvious that if you start to see a trajectory of growth increase very early on, they would be the babies in the whānau that you would want to be following up as people, not people, but as people that you would want to have conversations with and continue alongside and partnering with. So that's just something that we need to think about as an organisation. Second question was anonymous. Does one size fit all? And I wasn't sure whether it was Lisa's observations or whether it was the FAN model. So maybe I'll throw it open to the whole three of you. And I think, Lisa, you have raised that one size doesn't fit all, and this is just a population health measure, but I'll leave it over to the three of you.
Yeah, I think that came up during the FAN model, but I just want to also go back to the previous question from Sharon, just around that 36-month mark. I think she was referring to one of the graphs that I presented. I'm sorry if I didn't make that entirely clear, but one of the graphs was showing that the trajectories of those who were obese at 5 in the blue line were going above that one standard deviation at around 36 months of age. So I think the concern was maybe if we're not measuring them beyond that, is that a problem? But what we are seeing is that those who have high, those that in that blue line were generally having a higher BMI even before 36 months of age, so that we're still measuring that trajectory, which is important, looking at those in those higher category.
Yeah, and we would want to stay with those to actually make sure we did monitor through the later months of childhood. Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. So Denise and Waikura, does one size fit all?
What I would say is it's not a one size, it's a model that actually fits all sizes in the sense that it's supporting us as practitioners to work out our best fit, our best way of attuning and having a good working relationship with this parent. So it can look completely different depending on the parent. So we have one scenario which could go in all sorts of different directions depending on the parent. So it actually is a model to enable you not to take a one size fits all approach, I think. It's a model that makes you have to be flexible. Yeah. Waikura.
Yeah, ngā mihi, Denise. I think this model, it crosses all boundaries. And so we talk about being a culturally responsive tool. And the thing about the FAN is that it's not linear, like it's not a process that you go, you're expected to go through every wedge. It actually, you go backwards and forwards in the wedge, but the whānau lead the visit. And that's where, if we're going to talk about one size fits all, it fits for the whānau, if we look at it that way. So it does cross all boundaries, and it is a guide. And when we talk about the overtopping one that has the beginning, the middle, and the end, that's the process that we're always checking in to make sure, are we on track? Are we getting to what you need? So yes.
So Waikura, I'm just going to jump to the last question from your colleague Guy. How does the fan work for whānau Māori and Pacifica? Is it culturally appropriate?
Absolutely. And this is anecdotally from me, from who predominantly engage with Māori whānau, Māori external practitioners as well. It's a wonderful tool to use even with supervision. So it really, there's no biases in this tool, which I love. And it really keeps you in check as a practitioner. Where am I supposed to be? Am I being culturally safe when I'm engaging with whānau? So, yes, Gabe, it is culturally safe.
Thank you. There's a couple of and Barry, you might want to chime in on this one. There's a couple asking around, so two kind of physiological questions, perhaps. One's around breast milk, transfer of glycemic tolerance, and obesity, and the link between obesity and breastfeeding. There's another one about meal and exercise advice, and there's a third one around the relationship between socioeconomic status and BMI. So I'll leave the researchers to answer those.
Okay, thank you. I just note that Kawiti wanted to answer live the question that we've just been dealing with. Kawiti, do you want to comment?
No, that was simply pressing the question had been answered.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll pass on to Lisa about the breast milk question. Is there any research about breast milk transfer of glycemic tolerance, and is breastfeeding best for obese women?
Yeah, it's not an area of research that I'm hugely familiar with. I know there is some out there, so it would be something I'd have to look into and get back to you. I think I did read maybe some recent research around whether breastfeeding is best for an obese woman, and I think a lot of that comes down to the initiation of breastfeeding that can be problematic. But again, as it's not an area I'm hugely familiar with, I'd have to have a dive into that first and get back to you if that's okay.
Yes, and I might just comment, certainly there's nothing, the quality of the breast milk is what I was hoping Lisa might comment on, because that's one of your interests. But in terms of if you're obese, is breastfeeding best for your baby? I think the answer is yes. The problem is initiating and maintaining breastfeeding is not so successful in the very overweight mothers. But where that can be maintained, and there's probably a lot bigger audience of expert breastfeeding lactation consultant people here who might want to comment on that. I know it's more difficult, but it is best for baby. There's some comments about BMI and socioeconomic status. The answer is that there's quite a large gradient in BMI averages by socioeconomic status, really within whichever ethnicity you want to look at. So I think that's sort of well known that weight issues and unhealthy weight issues are much more common if you are poor and can't access healthy food, as well as people that are relatively rich. That's sort of well known and well established. Lisa may want to comment further, but so that's the socioeconomic status model. Are there perhaps, I warned Lisa that this question would come up. What about BMI and different ethnicities?
Yeah, so The WHO growth standards that we're looking at are based on multi-ethnic populations. So in terms of the reference population, it should be appropriate to use for all ethnicities. In New Zealand, there's some research in children that shows that BMI is highly associated with percentage of body fat in children of all ethnicities. So that is relevant to be using BMI for all ethnicities. And the biggest thing is that we should be tracking those BMIs over time. So that's really the important part, regardless of ethnicity.
Yeah, and I mean, this has been discussed with the Ministry of Health at some length over the years. In the WHO standards did not include Pacific people in any of their basic development work, which is a bit of a problem because they might be quite unique in many ways in terms of how their body weight tracks. But I think the correct answer is the cut points for one observation, just as Lisa said, shouldn't really be used as a diagnosis. But if you've got a trend, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. If your trend is rapidly going upwards, the pattern of growth should be the same across ethnicities.
And just while we're on that, researchers, someone asks about the BMI trajectory and the relationship between different feeding modalities, breastfeeding, artificial. Is there any, what is the research showing us about that?
Lisa, do you want to do that?
I hadn't seen that one. So my understanding is the World Health Organization, the growth standards are based on a healthy breastfed baby. But again, as we've said for ethnicity, regardless of feeding mode, we're looking at those trajectories over time. Yeah.
So are you saying you don't have an opinion on that, Lisa? Come on.
At this stage, I don't feel like
you'd want to express it as a researcher. You sound like Graham LeGros or whatever his name is. I'm a scientist. But that's all right.
Did you want to add something, Barry?
So what was the question again? Just I got slightly.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it.
Distinguishing the growth trajectories based on the feeding mode. So.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think that is quite an interesting question. There's no doubt that bottle-fed babies or artificially milk-fed babies do tend to grow somewhat faster than breastfed babies. And that's partly because when you're breastfeeding, you self-regulate, and you stop feeding when you're not so hungry. Whereas in bottle-fed babies, there's a much greater chance that they'll want to finish the bottle, or the parent will want them to finish the bottle, and therefore more than necessarily than what they actually need. And so in some ways, when you're seeing a baby with the chart showing this rapid acceleration in BMI, and they're bottle fed, then there's a very easy way of saying, well, how much is the baby getting, and are you insisting that they finish the bottle? So there's some behavioral things that you can start working with very quickly and very obviously, whereas in a breastfeeding baby who's doing the same thing, it's slightly more subtle and somewhat more difficult to separate out how much they're eating versus activity. So in some ways, so the answer is bottle feeding. Certainly they do grow a bit faster, mainly because they probably are getting more than they need.
Thank you. Now we sadly have to stop this. There's a question about BMI calculator, and a lot of them seem to be coming from Whānau Āwhina. So that's one we will take offline, but we could also answer any of the questions we haven't answered. We will answer online in a way. Michelle organises that for us. I can't remember how it happens. I just want to say before we close, and Kapiti's not sure that his internet's going to let him down or not, but we'll. But before we close, I just want to say this is the third in a series of 3 that Better Start National Series Science Challenges have been offering. We had one on sleep, one on SUDI, and this one on growth. It's been hugely popular with lots of clinicians, and so I want to thank the organisers, Michelle, Julie, Kapiti, and I also want to thank all the presenters across the whole 3 series, and you, Barry, for being such a good sport and co-chairing. And then lastly, all the audience. It's been fantastic. The community of child health has come together in this beautiful way. So I just want to thank you all, and I'm going to hand over to you, Kapiti.
Kia ora, Jane. Yeah, just supporting everything everybody said. Wonderful, wonderful presentations. And I'll just finish with a brief karakia. So thanks, everybody.
Can I just say that there's one more thing, that we will look at the questions and try and answer them. And so when this goes on the web, we will hopefully have a document with each of the questions that we might not have answered during the Q&A actually answered on a piece of paper. So that'll be available after this.
Okay.
Thanks, Barry. Awesome. Okay. Unuhia, te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te hinengaro, te ngākau, te wairua, te tinana i te arataka tū, ko ia rā i rongo whakairia, ki runga, kia tīna, haumie, huie, tai kie. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye for now.
Ora. Mā te wā.